Her niece's son dragged a cardboard cutout of her onto the dance floor, while the rest of the family clapped. Margaret Weston, 74, watched the video alone, mocked by the very nieces and nephews she'd once paid tuition for. "Still kicking? Barely," her great-niece Gina had joked. By morning, Margaret had slashed every name from her will, except one. She'd spent a lifetime loving them like her own children. Now she'd leave them nothing, not even her silence. "Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe." The kettle clicked off with a soft sigh, steam curling up toward the yellowed ceiling of Margaret Weston's tidy kitchen. She moved slowly, knees whispering their disapproval, and poured the hot water over a single chamomile tea bag in her porcelain mug, white with a faded cardinal on one side, the handle chipped but still loyal. Outside, the oaks cast long, crooked shadows across the frost-nipped lawn. It was late February in North Georgia, the kind of day where even the birds seemed to keep quiet. Margaret, 74, widowed 17 years, childless by time and circumstance, sipped her tea while staring out the window. Her world was a series of neat routines: Wednesdays at the library, Sundays at church, Thursdays watering the same stubborn roses, and none of it ever felt lonely. Not really. Not until today. "Did you see this?" her friend Barbara had asked over the phone, her voice tight in that way people use when they're not sure if something's funny or cruel. It's something. Now, as Margaret sat on the edge of her floral couch, laptop open on her knees, she braced herself. Barbara had sent the link: public photos from a family reunion last weekend. Florida. Bright sun, Hawaiian shirts and paper lays. Her cousin Andrew's house, it looked like. Maybe near Tampa. She hadn't been invited, not even a courtesy call. The photos loaded in jerky little chunks. There was Lori, her niece, pregnant again, and glowing in a way that seemed curated. There was James and his husband, holding their adopted twins. So many faces, familiar, cheerful, bronzed by vacation and bloodline. But not one of them had thought to include her. Then, the image. Her breath stilled in her throat. A full-size cardboard cutout stood near the buffet table. Her face, her body, a stiff version of herself in her Easter church dress, somehow photoshopped to exaggerate the pearls and the bun she hadn't worn since 2014. A cartoon speech bubble had been added, hovering above her head like a cruel halo. "Still talking about the war bonds." Laughter in the comments, a string of emojis, crying with laughter. Old woman, ghost. Her great-niece, Gina, had captioned it, "Still kicking, barely." Margaret didn't flinch. Not at the text, not at the 34 likes, not even at the cousin who replied, "She'd die all over again if she saw this." She just stared. Her hand didn't shake as she lifted the tea to her lips. Her face betrayed nothing. She simply clicked to the next image. There was the cutout again, this time propped beside a tiki bar, a plastic cup shoved in its hand. Someone had drawn liver spots on the cardboard arms with a Sharpie. In the corner, a teenaged boy posed next to it, holding up a peace sign. The window above her sink reflected the laptop screen faintly, a ghostly twin of herself watching over her shoulder. Margaret shut the lid gently, rested her hands atop it, and took another sip. The taste had gone bitter. From outside came the sound of a truck rumbling past, the neighbor's son heading off to work at the mill. Margaret didn't move. Her eyes drifted toward the fireplace mantel, where a modest row of framed photographs stood in solemn silence. Her late husband George in his uniform, a church potluck from 1982, and a fading black-and-white shot of her as a girl holding a box turtle. No reunion pictures, no laughing children in swimsuits or beer cans held high. She glanced at the old cuckoo clock above the TV. It was 2 minutes to noon. Margaret stood, moved with calm purpose to the writing desk in the corner, and pulled open the second drawer. Inside, envelopes, a notepad, and her will, folded neatly in a blue plastic sleeve. She stared at it for a moment, then closed the drawer without touching anything. Instead, she walked back to the window. The trees swayed, brittle with winter, silent sentinels. Behind her, the laptop remained unopened, the glowing screen now dark. Then the phone rang. Unknown number. Margaret stared at it as it buzzed against the coffee table. She didn't answer, but her fingers curled ever so slightly around the armrest, and her lips, for the first time that day, pressed into a line of quiet resolve. Margaret sat at the kitchen table beneath the quiet tick of the wall clock, a soft pencil balanced in her hand like a loaded needle. Before her, a yellow legal pad, 2 pages deep already, lined with names, each one pulled straight from the photographs she'd refused to save but hadn't needed to. They were etched into her mind now with more clarity than she cared to admit. Lori, James, Gina, Carl, even that gawky teenager with the peace sign, Nathan, if memory served. His mother once called Margaret the family historian, back when that meant something warmer than the family relic. She drew a line through Lori's name, then another through Gina's, neat, precise slashes that didn't tremble. To her right, the blue plastic sleeve sat once more on the table. Inside, her current will, printed 3 months ago, still bearing the notary stamp. She hadn't looked at it since the last time she and Deborah Klein, her lawyer of 12 years, reviewed the document. Deborah had sat right here, sipping lemon water and smiling that cautious, legal smile. "Are you sure about everyone listed?" she had asked gently, fingers steepled. "Family sentiment can shift, be sure." At the time, Margaret had nodded with quiet confidence. She remembered how she'd laughed even, "They're all I have left, really." What she hadn't said then was how deeply she'd meant it. She opened the will slowly, smoothing the pages as if she were ironing out betrayal. Her eyes moved down the neat paragraphs of bequests. To Lori, payment of remaining student loans, not to exceed $60,000. To James, full rights to the lakeside cabin in Ellijay. To Gina, her stamp collection, including the rare 1918 inverted Jenny. Each gift had been given with intention, kindness even, but none of them had thought to ask where she was, or why the old chair at the family table sat empty. Margaret picked up her pen, not the pencil this time, but her black fountain pen, and, line by line, began crossing out every name. The ink bled slightly into the paper fibers, but her hand stayed firm. A steady rhythm formed. Name, pause, slash. Name, pause, slash, until only one name remained. At the bottom of the second page, written in smaller script than the rest, Emily Ruth Gardner. She hesitated then, not from doubt, but memory. Emily, her goddaughter, not blood, but better. She was born to Margaret's childhood best friend, May, who died far too young and left the girl in the care of a rotating door of relatives. Margaret had stepped in for birthdays, high school plays, and late-night phone calls about scholarships. Quiet visits, simple gestures. Not often, but always enough. And Emily, she hadn't been at that reunion. Margaret was certain of it. The girl wasn't in any photos, hadn't posted anything, and hadn't laughed in those cruel little comment threads. Margaret stared at the name, then underlined it. Once, twice. She turned the page over and began drafting a new note beneath the bequests, a clause Deborah had mentioned before but she'd never thought she'd need. Any individual who contests this will, in part or full, shall forfeit all claims, property, or inheritances stated herein. She wrote it slowly, carefully. Her pen scratched the paper like a whisper sharpening into warning. The house creaked as the afternoon sun moved westward, lighting up the edge of the table with a soft amber glow. Shadows stretched toward her, long and lean like the arms of the past. She closed the folder, placed it gently back into the drawer, and clicked it shut. Across the room, her answering machine blinked once. A missed message. Probably junk, she thought. Or worse. One of them, finally remembering she existed. But she didn't press play. Instead, she walked into the front room, sat in her husband's old recliner, and stared at the wall opposite. Framed on it was a black and white photo of George in the garden, grinning, hands in the dirt. She smiled faintly. Then, as the light dimmed and dusk reached through the windows like cold fingers, her eyes moved to a smaller frame beside it. Emily's graduation photo. Cap askew. A rare, lopsided grin. Margaret leaned forward as if reaching for something intangible and whispered to the empty room, "Let's see how they all react when I disappear from more than just their party." Margaret didn't go out much during the week unless it was necessary, but Saturday mornings had a rhythm to them. She'd walk down the gravel path to fetch her mail, say a polite word or two to whichever neighbor was tending their lawn, then return to her front porch where the world could pass her by unnoticed. That morning, Tom Jacobs was trimming his boxwoods again, those poor shrubs she suspected he loved more than his own children. He waved his trimmer toward her like it was an extension of his arm. "Morning, Miss Margaret," he called over the hedge. "You hear about that reunion your folks had down in Florida?" Margaret blinked, then gave a slow, measured nod. "Saw a few pictures," she said, voice cool as the wind brushing through the bare maple trees. Tom chuckled in that harmless, clueless way men of his age sometimes did when they knew they were walking into something they didn't fully understand. "Brought it up at Rotary yesterday. Folks sure had a laugh. Somebody called you their ancient mascot." He laughed again, then faltered when she didn't join him. Margaret smiled tightly. "How charming," she said, then turned back toward her porch without another word. Once inside, she placed the mail on the side table unopened, a grocery flyer, a newsletter from her church, and a slim envelope with no return address. She didn't touch it yet. Instead, she sank into her recliner and pulled the knit blanket over her lap. The light in the living room had gone soft and dusty, like the hush before a thunderstorm. She closed her eyes for a moment, just one, and let herself feel the weight of the words, ancient mascot. Not Aunt, not Margaret, not even Margie. She didn't expect reverence, but she hadn't expected to become a punchline either. The soft ding of her phone pulled her back. A message, from an unknown number. She hesitated, then tapped it open. Geraldine H. "Margaret, I wasn't going to say anything, but I think you should see this. I'm sorry." Attached. A video file. Geraldine. Her sister Helen's best friend for nearly 5 decades, the woman who still called every year on Margaret's birthday, even when no one else did. Margaret tapped the screen. The video opened on a shaky shot of a dance floor, cheap string lights, plastic palm trees, drunk laughter echoing from tinny speakers. At the center of it all stood it, the cardboard cutout, her face caught mid-sentence, arms stiff at her sides. Someone had affixed googly eyes over the printed ones. The figure jerked and bounced, clumsily manipulated by a teenage boy and a man in cargo shorts. They spun it in circles, made it shimmy, tilted its head like it was nodding along to the beat. A woman off-screen shouted, "Look, it's Aunt Margaret's ghost at the luau." Laughter exploded. Then a deeper voice chimed in, slurring but loud, "She'll haunt this place before she dies." Someone whooped. Another voice added, "At least she showed up for once." The camera panned wildly as Geraldine must have lowered her phone, and the footage ended with muffled giggles and a flash of neon from the DJ booth. Margaret sat still, the video frozen in her hand. The image on screen showed the cutout mid-spin, its face warped under the glow of a strobe light. She didn't cry. She didn't throw the phone or delete the file. She simply pressed save, renamed the clip Family Luau, and moved it into a new folder. Documentation. Then she returned to the unopened envelope on the table. Inside, a single Polaroid. The cutout again. This time propped beside a surfboard and draped in lace, a solo cup taped to one hand. On the back, in looping purple ink, "Wish you were here, Auntie M. Love." Gina Margaret stared at the ink, her jaw tight enough to ache. Her hand still steady, folded the photo precisely in half and slid it into the same folder on her desktop. She leaned back in her chair, the soft creak of old wood echoing in the quiet. The last of the afternoon light faded behind her lace curtains, and Margaret Weston, who had survived storms, widowhood, and a lifetime of silence, began to plan. The scratching of the fountain pen was the only sound in the room, soft and steady, like a quill dragging across time itself. Deborah Klein adjusted her glasses and glanced over the rim at Margaret, who sat across from her at the kitchen table with the solemn poise of someone carving words into stone. The will lay open between them. Neat, crisp pages, clean lines about to be crossed. Deborah tapped her pen lightly against her notepad. "You're sure?" she said, though it wasn't a question. Margaret didn't look up. She crossed out another name, her handwriting deliberate. "They already made their choice, Deborah. I'm simply echoing it in ink." The attorney leaned back slightly, watching. In all the years she'd represented Margaret, through estate filings, minor property disputes, even a tangle over cemetery plots, she'd never seen her this still. There was no hesitation, no tremor of second thoughts. "I just need you to be aware," Deborah said, her voice low but firm. "Once we file this and the alternate is registered, we can't walk it back. If someone contests, they lose everything," Margaret finished. A flicker of approval crossed Deborah's face. She wasn't a woman moved easily, but she respected resolve. "It'll hold. It's ironclad. But you'll be cutting out a dozen people. Some of them might—" Margaret looked up then. Her eyes were steady, unblinking. "They danced with a cardboard corpse, Deborah. They mocked a living woman in front of her legacy. They celebrated my absence, and they sent me a photograph of it." Silence bloomed between them. Deborah said nothing more. One by one they reviewed the items. The Elijah cabin deed, now unassigned. The art prints, the war bond certificates, the stamp collection. Margaret slid each across the table, rescinding their destinations with a stroke of her pen. When they reached the page marked Beneficiary Allocation, Margaret wrote in a single name with sharp, practiced cursive, "Emily Ruth Gardner." No middlemen, no contingencies, no apologies. Deborah scanned the updated clauses, her eyes catching on the handwritten addition. "Any individual who contests this will, directly or through counsel, forfeits all claims in perpetuity, including future estate value, land access, or archived holdings." She arched a brow. "You wrote this yourself?" "I did," Margaret replied. "If they try to claw anything back, I want the clause broken before they start." They printed 2 copies. Deborah notarized each, her seal pressing clean into the parchment. The embossed edge glinted under the kitchen's overhead light like a wax seal from another century. The second copy went into a fireproof envelope. Deborah sealed it with tape, then labeled it in her crisp lawyer's script. "Filed copy. Weston, Margaret H. and Gardner, Emily R." She reached across the table and tapped the sealed packet once with her index finger. "This is airtight," she said. "Once I file it at the county office, there's no going back." Margaret nodded. Deborah hesitated. "You haven't told Emily?" "No," Margaret said quietly. "She doesn't need to know. Not yet." Deborah exhaled, leaning back in her chair. "You know, most people your age cling to family even when it hurts. You're doing something few have the stomach for." "I've buried a husband, a sister, and the last of my illusions," Margaret said softly. "What else is there to cling to?" They sat in silence for a moment, the kind that fills rooms between women who understand the weight of what isn't being said. Then, as Deborah packed her briefcase and clicked it shut, the wind picked up outside. A rustle of brittle leaves scratched against the window pane, and somewhere in the distance, a wind chime struck a single high note like a warning bell. Margaret didn't flinch. As Deborah stepped onto the porch, she turned back. "They won't take it well." Margaret followed her gaze to the empty road, gray with dusk. "I'm counting on it." She closed the door behind her and turned the lock. Then, with deliberate calm, she walked to her desk, opened her laptop, and clicked the folder marked Documentation. There was one more entry to be added. The letters were printed on thick cream paper, the kind that took ink without bleeding, the kind you didn't throw away without noticing. Each envelope bore no return address, just the family member's name, handwritten in Margaret's exacting cursive, and a forever stamp in the corner. Inside, a single line. "Thank you for remembering me at the reunion. Margaret." That was it. No signature flourish, no bitterness, no address. Just quiet presence, like a whisper in an empty hallway. It took 3 days for the responses to begin. Gina, ever the first to detect shifting winds, sent a text. "Hey, got your note. We were just joking. Hope you're doing okay?" Margaret didn't reply. She saved the message in a folder labeled CYA texts and moved on. Carl left a voicemail full of ums and half-laughed guilt. We thought you'd find it funny. You always like jokes. Anyway, hope to catch up sometime soon." She deleted it from her phone, but not before recording a backup. Lori sent nothing. Neither did James. But someone, she suspected Gina again, had tipped off the rest. The reunion group chat grew quiet overnight. Hashtags disappeared. Posts were deleted. The digital trail began to wash itself clean, unaware that Margaret had archived everything days ago. Then, the email came. From Geraldine. Subject: "You should see this." Attached: a screen recording of a private video chat. 10 cousins in little windows, their faces animated, some on phones, some in kitchens, one in a car. The kind of casual cluster that breeds mean familiarity. Margaret clicked play. "I swear," Gina was saying, hair in a top knot, chewing on something off screen. "She must have hired someone to send those notes, like she doesn't even know how email works." Someone else, Jacob, maybe, snorted, "Trust me, she's not behind it. She probably thinks TikTok is a mint." They laughed. Then Lori chimed in, arms crossed, clearly irritated. "Well, it's creepy. I mean, she didn't even call. Just that note. Like a ghost, leaving messages." A third voice broke in. Jason. Always the loudest. "My dad says she's got a will somewhere. Maybe she's trying to guilt us. Joke's on her. What would we even get? Stamps and casseroles?" "No," said Gina, suddenly smug. "She's got money. That cabin's worth something. There's a trust or whatever. Unless she put it all in. What's that thing old people love? A doily fund?" Jason laughed so hard he wheezed. "She won't even know what a trust fund is. Probably thinks it's a bank that won't steal from her." The laughter swelled again. Margaret sat still as stone, her face impassive. She didn't fast forward. She didn't flinch. She let the full 12-minute video roll, absorbing every careless word, every echo of their comfort with her absence. And then, with the calm precision of a surgeon, she began to type. Group chat recording, March 7th. Participants: Gina W., Jason M., Lori P., Jacob F., Carl D., etc. Transcript: "She won't even know what a trust fund is. Probably thinks TikTok is a mint. Like a ghost leaving messages. What would we even get? Stamps and casseroles." Each quote was timestamped, filed, backed up in 2 separate cloud folders. Documentation wasn't just insurance anymore, it was narrative control. That evening, as the light outside turned a warm peach over her frost-bitten rose beds, Margaret stood at her front door and listened. Not to the wind, not to the passing cars, but to the silence inside herself. It no longer ached. It sharpened. Her phone buzzed again. Another cousin, this time with the gall to say, "Didn't mean to hurt your feelings. You know how family gets." Margaret stared at the screen, then typed back just 2 words. "Do I?" She didn't press send. Instead, she opened her laptop, pulled up the contact for Deborah Klein, and began drafting a message. Subject: "One more clause?" The days that followed unfolded like pressed petals, deliberate, delicate, preserved for their shape more than their scent. Margaret still swept the porch every morning, still moved through her home with the care of someone tending to sacred ground, still greeted the postman, waved politely to the teenager who walked his lab past her yard after school. But everything she did was sharper now, intentional. She didn't rush, but she didn't waste either. On Monday, she pulled her address book from the roll-top desk and underlined names. Not the family, not anymore. These were neighbors, friends, acquaintances from the quilting club and church, people she wanted remembered, not for herself, but for Emily's sake later. A quiet curation of human kindness. By Wednesday, she was online. It wasn't instinctive, but she was capable. She opened the browser, logged into the dummy account she'd set up weeks ago, and searched for Gina's profile, then Carl's, then Jacob's. She didn't friend anyone. She simply watched. Gina had posted a throwback video, filtered, smiling, sipping something neon-colored by a Florida pool. The caption read, "Still recovering from the best fam weekend ever. Love my crew." Margaret clicked save. Carl had reposted an article about generational wealth with a comment that read, "Real legacy starts with smart wills." Margaret blinked once, then copied the post into her observations folder. Each move, each word, each bit of curated reality they projected, she catalogued it, not out of obsession, but out of clarity. Because while they posted in public, they forgot who might still be watching. Friday, she drove herself into town. Her steps were careful, her pace steady, but her mind moved like a pendulum counting down towards something irreversible. The notary's office was small, just a single room inside a converted law office on Main Street. The woman behind the desk wore red glasses and smelled faintly of cinnamon gum. Margaret placed the final copy of the revised will on the counter like an offering. "I just need this last one sealed," she said quietly. The notary reviewed the forms, glanced up once with a flicker of recognition, but said nothing beyond the formalities. Seal, stamp, signature. When she left, Margaret sat in her car for a full minute before turning the key. She didn't cry. She didn't tremble. She just stared through the windshield at the slow drift of leaves falling from a sugar maple across the street, amber spiraling down like thoughts too heavy to hold. That night, she wrote a letter. Not typed, not formal, just ink and paper, the same steady cursive she'd used in her college journals and the postcards she'd once sent George from antique shows. "Dear reader, if you're reading this, I'm already gone. That's not meant to be dramatic, it's just a fact of the timeline. You're wondering why I made the choices I did. I'm not angry, truly, not anymore. I think disappointment sits deeper than anger. Anger can be thrown like a stone. Disappointment just settles. It roots. It changes the soil around it. What I saw hurt me. But more than that, it clarified everything. This letter is not a revenge note, it's a truth note, and I hope one day it helps someone else see clearly too. M.H.W." She folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and wrote on the front, "To be opened after." She tucked it into the same folder that held the updated will, then slid the folder back into its drawer, resting her palm atop it for a long breath. Outside, a storm was gathering. A low grumble of thunder rolled along the sky like a prelude to something heavier. She stood, went to the window, and watched the clouds knit themselves tight. Then, almost absently, she whispered into the glass, "If they only knew what silence really sounds like." The knock at the door was soft. Not hesitant, just gentle, like the person behind it had knocked on this door many times and didn't need to announce themselves loudly. Margaret wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and opened the door to find Emily Gardner standing on the porch with a brown paper bag cradled in her arms. "Hope I'm not too early," Emily said, cheeks flushed pink from the breeze. "You're right on time," Margaret replied, stepping aside to let her in. "Smells like rosemary." Emily smiled, tucking a loose strand of hair behind her ear. "Stew, and I brought the good kind of bread, not the sad kind in plastic sleeves." She moved through the house as naturally as if she lived there, placing the bag on the kitchen counter, unwrapping a mason jar of homemade stew, a tin of fresh-baked cornbread, and 2 tea bags tucked into a napkin like a peace offering. Margaret set the kettle on, her hands slower than they used to be but still graceful. They settled in at the table, the same place where so many decisions had been written into permanence. Today, though, there were no contracts, no revisions, just warmth and steam rising from their mugs. Emily dipped her cornbread in the stew and sighed. "You ever notice how it's impossible to be angry while eating soup?" Margaret smiled. "Only if it's good soup." For nearly 2 hours they talked. Not about family, not about betrayal, but about the books Emily was reading, an obscure Appalachian memoir, a graphic novel about grief, a collection of Mary Oliver poems she'd reread twice in 1 week. Margaret listened with quiet interest, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking questions. It was the kind of conversation that asked nothing in return, no defense, no apology, just presence. Emily looked up between bites, her expression turning thoughtful. "I didn't go," she said. Margaret didn't ask what she meant. She knew. Emily continued anyway. "The reunion. I was going to. Bought a dress, packed a bag, But the day before, I just couldn't. Something felt off. Margaret kept her gaze steady. That's a rare thing, to listen to yourself before someone else tells you how to feel. Emily shrugged, picking at the edge of the bread. It didn't feel right without you. That was the honest part. Margaret's eyes misted, just faintly, just for a breath. She blinked slowly and offered a small, private smile. No one makes stew like you, she said instead, because some acknowledgments were too sacred to say aloud. As the sky darkened and the wind shifted again, Emily stood to go, gathering the empty tin and jars with practiced ease. Margaret walked her to the door. The chill had crept in while they'd talked, and Emily pulled on her peacoat from the coat rack, patting her pockets for her keys. "Left pocket," Margaret murmured. Emily looked at her, puzzled. Margaret reached out and gently adjusted the collar of her coat, smoothing it down. "There's a letter in there," she said softly. "Not to open now, later." Emily stared at her, something unreadable flashing behind her eyes. Concern, maybe, or recognition of something more final than the moment allowed. "Okay," she said. "I'll wait." Margaret nodded, stepping back inside. Emily stood on the porch a moment longer, then smiled. "I'll bring lemon cake next time." Margaret didn't answer right away. She just closed the door gently. Inside, the house felt warmer somehow. Not because of the tea or the stew, but because something had landed, quietly, wholly, in its right place. She walked to the window and watched Emily drive away, the red taillights blinking through the dusk. Then she returned to her desk, opened the drawer, and removed a small key. It belonged to the lockbox in the hall closet, something even Emily didn't know existed. She held the key in her palm for a long moment before slipping it into a new envelope, sealing it, and writing on the front, "Emily Gardner. Only if they ask." The week moved with the silence of freshly fallen snow. No drama, no declarations. Just one task after another, completed with Margaret's unshakable grace. Monday morning, she brought out the large cedar box from under her bed and laid its contents across the quilt. Receipts, photos, insurance paperwork, George's discharge papers from the Navy, a dried corsage from a wedding she couldn't remember attending. She sorted everything into neat stacks, labeling each one in clean block letters: medical, tax history, George's keepsakes, Emily, personal. She moved slowly but without pause, like a woman repacking a life. In the afternoon, she opened the closet and pulled down a bin of photo albums. The oldest ones smelled of glue and worn plastic, pages sticking slightly. She removed duplicates, labeled dates and names with soft pencil strokes. Family faces smiled up at her from birthdays, cookouts, graduations, none of whom had called in years. She didn't discard them. She simply wrote history on the cover and placed them in a separate bin. Let them choose what to do with the past. On Tuesday, she visited the local high school's agricultural department. She walked in with a brown paper bag filled with pruning shears, trowels, and a kneeling mat patched with duct tape. "These helped me raise 100 roses and 24 regrets," she told the teacher, a wiry woman with soil under her fingernails. "They'll go to good use," the woman promised, her eyes softening. Margaret smiled and walked back to her car with lighter hands. Wednesday, she mailed out her final letter. A single page, handwritten, addressed to Geraldine. "Dear G, of all the people who could have stayed silent, you didn't. Thank you for telling me the truth when no one else did. I see you. I remember you. I always have. Love, Margaret." She placed a sprig of dried lavender in the envelope before sealing it. By Thursday, the house had been swept, aired, and polished. The kitchen was spotless, the fridge nearly empty except for milk, 2 eggs, and half a lemon cake Emily had left behind. She set the table for one and brewed her tea, chamomile her usual. She sat in her favorite chair near the window, the one with the flattened cushion and faded armrests, and gazed out across her backyard. It was quiet. The bird feeder swayed slightly in the breeze, visited only by a squirrel too fat for his own good. The windmill turned lazily, creaking like an old friend clearing its throat. Margaret took a sip, then another. A notebook rested on her lap, but she didn't open it. Instead, she closed her eyes. Her final thought wasn't of vengeance, it wasn't even of the will. It was of the last time Emily had laughed, really laughed, at a corny joke about soup and fury. That tiny, uncontaminated moment of connection. That was the ember she carried with her into sleep. The next morning, the sun rose early and clear. At precisely 8:07 a.m., her neighbor Tom Jacobs knocked gently on the front door. He had come to return a casserole dish Margaret had insisted she didn't need back. There was no answer. He tried again, knocked harder. Still no sound. He let himself in, something she'd once told him he could do in case of emergencies. The front door creaked open to a house bathed in morning light and stillness. The teacup on the side table was empty. Margaret sat in her chair, head gently tilted, eyes closed. Peaceful, unmoved, gone. Tom whispered her name once, then again. He backed out slowly, hand trembling as he reached for his phone. Across town, in a law office just beginning to stir with morning traffic, Deborah Klein's receptionist picked up a call that would reroute the lives of a dozen people. By noon, the phones would ring. By evening, Emily's would buzz with a voice message she never expected. And by the next sunrise, a legacy long dismissed as dust would roar awake, sealed and irreversible. The news spread faster than anyone expected. Lori was the first to text the family group chat, the one that had gone mostly silent since the reunion. Margaret passed. Neighbor found her this morning, peacefully apparently. For a few minutes, the thread remained quiet. Then Gina responded with a gif of a single white candle, a weak stab at sentiment. Carl chimed in next. Do we know who's handling her estate? No one answered that question directly, but the implications began to multiply. Jacob. I remember she had that lake cabin, right? Jason. Did anyone call dibs on the stamps? Lowell. Lori. Let's just be respectful, okay? Gina. Respectful doesn't mean stupid. She had assets. We should be included. By afternoon, half a dozen of them were standing on Margaret's front porch like buzzards circling a locked mausoleum. The key under the flower pot was gone. The door didn't budge. Jason tried a window. Changed, he muttered. Everything's changed. Lori stepped back and folded her arms, surveying the house like it owed her something. She must have had a safe, or at least a file box. Her lawyer, Deborah Klein, right? Gina already had her phone out. I'm calling. 10 minutes later, Deborah's receptionist informed her of the concerned relatives requesting a same-day meeting. They'll be here in an hour, she told Deborah, who simply nodded and began preparing the file. By 3 o'clock, the conference room at Klein & Associates was full. The family took their seats, each pretending not to see the folders and notepads clutched in the other's hands. Jason brought a manila envelope labeled Asset Inquiry. Gina had an iPad. Carl sat quietly, but with his real estate agent already on speed dial. Deborah entered exactly on time, hair pinned tight, blazer charcoal gray, expression unreadable. Thank you all for coming, she said, setting a thick folder gently on the table. As Margaret Weston's attorney and executor, I'll be reading her most recently notarized and registered will. She paused. No small talk, no condolences. Lori cleared her throat. We all just want to honor her properly, of course. Deborah looked directly at her, and then unfolded the top document. I'll begin. The room stilled. I, Margaret H. Weston, being of sound mind and firm intent, leave the entirety of my estate, real and liquid assets, property, heirlooms, and intellectual holdings, to my goddaughter, Emily Ruth Gardner. No other individual is entitled to any portion of my estate, directly or by proxy. Furthermore, any attempt to challenge or contest this will, in whole or in part, shall result in immediate and total forfeiture of all claims, present or future, by said party. The silence that followed wasn't solemn. It was electric. Jason leaned forward. That's it? Gina blinked, jaw slightly ajar. Wait, everything? Like, everything? Everything? Lori was pale, lips pressed together. Emily. She wasn't even at the reunion. Deborah flipped to the next page and tapped the notarization seal. This version was filed with the county clerk 5 weeks ago, legally binding, witness certified. There is no alternate version in effect. Jacob muttered. Is she even family? Closer than most of you, Deborah replied evenly. Carl cleared his throat. Look, I mean, maybe Margaret wasn't thinking clearly. She was older. Was she influenced? Deborah closed the folder. If you wish to file a formal contestation, you are welcome to do so. Be advised that any such action will invoke the disqualification clause already stated. Jason opened his mouth to argue, but nothing came out. The room fell into another heavy silence, now full of resentment, confusion, and the deep, dawning understanding that the game was over, and they'd never even read the rules. A knock interrupted them. The receptionist peeked in. Ms. Klein? Emily Gardner is here. Deborah didn't miss a beat. Show her in. Every pair of eyes turned toward the door, and into the room stepped Emily, coat still damp from the drizzle outside, eyes wide but steady. She looked around the room at faces that had barely registered her existence. Hi, she said softly. I got your message. No one answered. Only Deborah stood, gesturing toward the chair at the head of the table. Emily, she said, this is all yours now. The paperwork came in by courier 3 days after the will was read. 3 separate filings, Jason, Gina, and Carl, all claiming undue influence and diminished mental capacity. Emily sat on the edge of Deborah's office couch, fingers woven tight in her lap. I don't understand, she said, voice small. They barely spoke to her. Deborah didn't flinch. She slid one document back into its envelope. That won't stop them. Greed makes people inventive. But it's protected, Emily. Margaret protected you. I didn't even know about the will. That's why it holds. Emily nodded, but her breath hitched anyway. It's just the way they looked at me. Like I was the thief. Deborah leaned forward, her voice low and certain. Let them go to court. We're ready. And they were. On the morning of the hearing, the courtroom smelled like lemon polish and old paper. Stale arguments clung to the air from cases past. The cousins filed in dressed in performative solemnity, dark suits, fake grief, aggressive dignity. Jason's lawyer, a man with 2 white teeth, opened with the phrase, vulnerable elder. Emily's face burned. She sat next to Deborah, her palms damp against the cold bench wood, while Jason claimed Margaret had been isolated, that Emily had inserted herself in Margaret's life during a period of confusion. Gina nodded tearfully from her seat. Carl avoided eye contact altogether. When it was their turn, Deborah stood with her folder already open. No theatrics, Your Honor, she said, just documentation. She began with the will. 3 notarized copies, all consistent, all recent. Then the visitor logs from the last 2 years, doctors, neighbors, Emily, no other family. Then came the letter, Margaret's posthumous note still sealed until that morning. I am not confused, I am not coerced, I am disappointed, and I am finally clear. Emily's hands trembled. The judge read in silence, then nodded for the next exhibit. Deborah tapped her laptop and a video began playing on the wall monitor. The cardboard cutout appeared first, dragged into frame, spun like a party favor. The room stilled. Margaret's voice had never been in the footage, but her presence, her face, floated lifelessly through it. The mock dancing, the shouting, the laughter. When the group chat recording followed, complete with Jason's, "She won't even know what a trust fund is," no one in the courtroom moved. The judge asked, "Who recorded this?" Geraldine raised her hand. "I did. I sent it to Margaret because she deserved to know. She was kind. She was quiet, but she was never stupid." Her voice cracked. "I warned them this was cruel. They didn't listen." The judge turned to Jason's lawyer. He looked suddenly unsure of his tie. By the time the footage ended, no one could meet Emily's eyes. Not even the cousins who had clapped the loudest in the video. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose. "I've seen a lot of contestations," he said, "but I've rarely seen a testator take this much care to ensure she wouldn't be erased." He folded his hands. "Petitions to contest are denied." Silence. Then a shuffle of chairs. Gina stood quickly, red-faced, whispering something sharp to her lawyer. Jason just sat, stunned. Emily remained frozen. Deborah placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "It's done," she whispered. "You're safe now." Emily's lips parted like she might speak, but no sound came out. The bailiff called for a short recess. Outside, reporters lingered near the courthouse steps, drawn in by whispers of a will war. As Emily stepped through the doors, a breeze lifted her coat. She paused on the top step, blinking into the gray afternoon, and saw Geraldine waiting near the curb. Geraldine nodded once, her eyes full of something between pride and sorrow. Emily didn't wave. She just exhaled and took the first step down. It started with a whisper over coffee. At the First Presbyterian Women's Fellowship Group, Geraldine quietly told the story. Not with flair or embellishment, but with the quiet conviction of someone who had witnessed something ugly and decided not to keep it tucked away anymore. She left it all to Emily, she told them, voice calm. Because Emily showed up, because the rest, well, they turned her into a joke. By Friday, the story had threaded itself through 3 congregations, the local librarian's morning Facebook post, and the staff room at the middle school. The version varied depending on who told it, but the shape stayed the same. Margaret Weston had been mocked in cardboard and repaid the favor in ink. The gossip spread beyond town limits. Someone had tipped off a regional paper, and an online article popped up 2 days later. Disinherited by the matriarch, How a Mocking Family Lost a Legacy. It was well written, brutal even. The author quoted anonymous court observers and included a blurred still of the cardboard cutout beside the tiki bar. The piece ended with a line that stung like cold air. Margaret Weston didn't die angry. She died disappointed and fully aware. The backlash came swift. Gina was the first to post on social media. "I loved my Aunt Margaret. We were just trying to lighten the mood. She always had a dry sense of humor." Jason reposted it with a caption, "Family gets messy sometimes. That doesn't mean we didn't care." Carl tried to stay out of it, but someone dug up an old post of his making fun of old people hoarding heirlooms like dragons. It resurfaced in the comments section of the article like a landmine. Then came the replies. "You danced with a cardboard version of her. You mocked her on camera. Spare us the revisionist history. She didn't forget you. You erased yourselves." One comment stood out, a single line from a woman named Brenda N. "I was at that reunion. I saw the cutout. Don't lie." It had over 300 likes in a day. Emily watched it all unfold from the quiet of Margaret's sunroom. She didn't engage, didn't post. Deborah had advised her to stay above the fray. "They're spinning the wheel," she said. "Let them wear themselves out." But the messages came anyway. Most were predictably hollow. "Hey, Em, just wanted to say I'm sorry for any misunderstanding. We didn't mean for it to come off that way. Hope you're doing okay. This is all so complicated." They tried to sound sympathetic. Some even used emojis. Emily didn't respond to any of them. She scrolled without reacting, her expression unreadable, until she reached one that made her stop cold. No subject line, no emojis, no typos. "Gina. Meet me at the diner. Just us. Tomorrow. Noon." Emily stared at the screen for a long time. Her thumb hovered over the delete icon. She didn't tap it. Instead, she stood and walked to the kitchen. On the counter sat a note she hadn't opened yet. Deborah had dropped it off that morning. It was from the lockbox Margaret had labeled "Only if they ask." Emily hadn't dared yet. She placed the phone beside it and stared at both, as if weighing 2 different kinds of ghosts. Outside, the wind shook the windows with a sudden gust. A single lemon from the backyard tree dropped onto the lawn and rolled uneaten into the grass. Emily whispered to no one, "Let's see what she really wants." The diner hadn't changed in years. Faux leather booths, linoleum floors faded into familiar patterns, and a wall clock shaped like a cow that had never once told the right time. The scent of burnt coffee and syrup hung in the air like a memory. Emily arrived 5 minutes early. She slid into a booth near the window where the sun streaked in through blinds that hadn't been dusted since the Clinton administration. She ordered tea, no lemon, and waited without checking her phone. At 12:04, Gina walked in. Her steps were slower than usual, shoulders tight beneath a camel coat too dressy for the setting. She clutched her purse like it might float away if she let go. When she spotted Emily, she offered a small wave. Not sheepish, not warm, just uncertain. Emily didn't stand. "Hey," Gina said, sliding into the opposite seat. "Thanks for meeting me." Emily nodded once. "You asked." Silence ballooned between them. Gina picked up the laminated menu, though she didn't look at it. Her eyes flitted from the napkin dispenser to the cracked salt shaker before landing back on Emily. "So," she said, too brightly, "how's everything going?" Emily blinked. "Margaret's dead. Her funeral was 3 days ago. You didn't come." Gina's mouth opened slightly, then shut again. "I thought maybe it'd be complicated." Emily said nothing. Gina tried again. "Look, I wanted to talk. About everything. I mean, the reunion stuff, it was just a joke." Emily folded her hands around her mug. "You said she wouldn't know what a trust fund was." "That wasn't me," Gina said quickly. "That was Jason." "You laughed." Gina swallowed. I didn't think she'd ever see it." Emily's voice was calm, flat. "So it would have been fine if she hadn't?" "No," Gina shook her head. "That's not what I meant. God, it got out of hand. You know how people are when they've been drinking." "You were sober." Another silence. Gina looked down at her hands, turning her wedding ring slowly. "She was just old, Emily. She'd been around forever. We didn't think—" Emily leaned forward slightly. "Didn't think she'd what?" Gina didn't answer. "Retaliate?" Emily pressed. "Matter?" Gina's eyes filled, but no tears fell. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. She was always kind of background, you know?" Emily nodded once. "Like wallpaper. Always there until you decide to paint over it." That one landed. Gina flinched. The waitress appeared and set down a slice of apple pie in front of her without asking. She smiled at Emily, who offered a faint one back. The waitress left without a word. "I'm not proud of it," Gina said finally. "But we were just trying to have fun. We weren't trying to hurt anyone." Emily stared at her across the chipped table. "Intent doesn't undo impact." Gina went quiet. Outside, the wind rattled the diner's sign. A leaf skittered across the window glass, then disappeared. "She really loved you, you know," Gina said, voice softer. "Margaret. She talked about you all the time when we were kids. I was jealous." Emily blinked, taken off guard. "She gave you something I don't think any of us thought she still had," Gina continued. "Trust." Emily's throat tightened, but she said nothing. Gina sighed, then stood. She pulled a small envelope from her coat pocket and slid it across the table. "This was in the attic, it's not much. Just something she wrote when I was in high school. I never opened it." Emily glanced at the envelope but didn't pick it up. "I don't expect forgiveness," Gina added, "but I thought maybe if I gave back anything." She didn't finish the sentence. She walked out without waiting for a reply, her heels clicking too loudly on the floor, her exit hurried and unsure. Emily looked down at the envelope. On it, in Margaret's handwriting, "Gina, for when you grow up." She stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to open it, burn it, or bury it with the rest of what had already passed. Her phone buzzed beside the plate. A message from Deborah. "You need to see what's in the final packet. Call me ASAP." Emily sat in Deborah's office once more, but this time there was no tension, no opposition. Just a thick folder between them, sealed with a navy ribbon and Margaret's name embossed in silver. "This is it," Deborah said softly, sliding it across the polished wood. Everything she didn't say out loud. Emily untied the ribbon with care, as if the paper itself might exhale. The first page was simple. A letter in Margaret's handwriting, dated 3 months before her passing. "This estate is not a reward. It is not vengeance. It is seed. What you do with it will speak louder than anything they said or failed to say." Emily read it twice. The packet contained more than deeds and bank balances. It held blueprints, social, emotional, and communal. Margaret had restructured her entire estate plan into a living act of restitution. 1/3 of her savings was allocated to fund grants for women's shelters across 3 counties. Emily turned the page and saw it spelled out, "For every woman who had nowhere to go when family closed the door." Another portion was set aside for senior citizens' technology education, so they'll never be made to feel invisible online. A new gardening fund would be established through the local 4-H chapter. Margaret's tools, her notes, even her pressed flower journals would be digitized and shared. Then came the house. It wasn't just left to Emily. It came with a clause, to be retained by Emily Ruth Gardner, provided she resides in the home for no less than 5 years and maintains the garden annual. Li. The land is not for flipping, the house is not for profit, it is for roots. Emily smiled. It was so Margaret, stern but sincere, and impossibly generous. The final page stunned her. A $25,000 endowment to the public school library renamed the Margaret H. Weston Reading Garden. Emily stared at the words. The margin note in Margaret's hand read, "So kids remember what quiet women can grow." Deborah closed the folder. "The town already approved the naming. They want you to speak at the ribbon cutting next week." Emily let out a shaky breath. She thought of everything. She did, Deborah agreed, and none of it was for show. 2 days later, the headline ran in the paper, not just local, but syndicated across the region. Elder left no fortune to family, gave future to town. Subhead: Mocked by relatives, Margaret Weston built a legacy they'll never inherit, but generations will. The piece included photos of the garden-to-be, renderings of the new library wing, and a quote from Geraldine. "She planted seeds when others buried her. That's all there is to it." The next Saturday, the ribbon cutting drew a modest but meaningful crowd: teachers, teens from the 4-H club, local reporters, and a few city officials. Emily wore Margaret's pearl pin, quietly placed on the lapel of a soft blue dress. The garden was still young, but it was vibrant. Planted from Margaret's own seedlings, kept safe in her greenhouse, and now tended by hands she'd never meet. Emily stood at the podium under a white tent, the wind warm for spring. She spoke plainly. "She taught me how to be still and how to notice. And she taught me that legacy isn't about who speaks loudest, it's about who keeps showing up." When the ceremony ended, she wandered through the flower beds, touching petals with reverence. At the far edge of the garden stood a stone bench. Above it, mounted to a trellis, a plaque read, "Be present, even when they don't see you." MHW. Emily sat down, the crowd thinning behind her, and watched bees dance through the lavender. A girl, maybe 9 or 10, approached shyly, holding a laminated pamphlet. "Are you the lady who knew Miss Margaret?" Emily nodded. "My mom said she was a ghost in her own family, but she's not anymore, right?" Emily swallowed the lump in her throat. "Number she's not." The girl nodded and skipped off. Emily looked up at the sky, then down at her phone. A voicemail notification blinked. A new one. From Lori. She didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her bag and pulled out Margaret's letter, the one marked, "Only if they ask." She opened it with steady hands. The house was still. Not lonely. Just paused, as if everything inside it was waiting for permission to keep breathing. Emily sat at Margaret's roll-top desk, its surface covered in a careful sprawl of lined notebooks, brittle receipts, and envelopes yellowed just enough to smell like time. The air carried lavender and old wood, the faintest trace of Margaret's hand cream still lingering on the drawer knobs. She opened each compartment slowly, not out of hesitation, but reverence. A drawer of church bulletins, each with handwritten notes in the margins. "Ask Emily if she's read this passage. Too much lemon and pie this week." Deborah's voice, strong. A cigar box filled with pressed flower petals and garden markers written in faded Sharpie. Foxglove, 1994. Rosemary, thrived in spite of me. And then, beneath the folded tea towels, a sealed envelope marked in ink-straight, unwavering print, "After." Emily hesitated for a heartbeat, then opened it. Inside was a letter, handwritten on the same ivory stationery Margaret had always used for thank-you notes. "Emily, by now, you've heard everyone else's opinions, their memories, their guilt, They're carefully shaped narratives. So here's mine. I changed the will because I watched people I loved forget how to love in return. They didn't hate me. That would have taken effort. They ignored me, erased me gently, with laughter and casual cruelty. I was not humiliated. I was discarded. And you came back. Again and again. Not for gain, not for display. You showed up when it was inconvenient. You didn't ask for a thing. You saw me. Legacy isn't about blood. Blood may connect us, but love builds legacy. I didn't leave this to you because you were perfect. I left it because you were present. Live here. Tend to the garden. Keep the windows open in the spring and let the bees do their work. If they come knocking again, and they might, you do not owe them explanations. You owe them truth. Thank you for remembering who I was while I was still here. Be well. Be rooted. Be exactly who you are. M.H.W. Emily read the letter once. Then again. Her hands trembled, but she didn't cry. Not yet. She stood and walked to the porch, the letter still clutched in one hand, Margaret's afghan wrapped around her shoulders. The swing creaked beneath her as she sat. Outside, the wind rolled gently through the garden beds. The rosemary had taken root again. The daffodils Margaret had planted 3 springs ago were beginning to rise, tender but stubborn, like the woman who had waited a lifetime to be heard. Emily read the letter aloud this time, softly, as if reading to someone just inside the screen door. By the final line, her voice broke. The tears came then, not as a sob, but as quiet release, grief uncurling in the afternoon sun, grief tempered by clarity. A car rolled past slowly, then stopped. A neighbor leaned out the window and waved. Another crossed the street carrying a bag of mulch, offered her a smile and nodded toward the yard. Emily waved back, wiping her cheek with the edge of the letter. The swing moved gently beneath her. From somewhere inside, the wind shifted a loose paper across the desk. One final envelope slid to the floor with a whisper. On the front, to be delivered 1 year from today. Emily didn't move. She just stared at it through the doorway, eyes full, heart steadying. The house hadn't just been inherited, it had been entrusted. The family never met again. Not for a memorial. Not for Christmas. Not even to fight. They didn't speak openly about the courtroom or the garden or the will. When asked, they used vague phrases. It was complicated. She had her reasons. Or the most hollow of all, let's not dredge up the past. Some moved to different cities. Others stopped posting online altogether. Jason's Facebook went dark after the article. Gina shared only pictures of her kids now, never tagging anyone, never commenting on anything Emily posted. Silence became their inheritance, and Margaret's decision became the one chapter they never included in family stories. But the house lived. Emily stayed. The 5-year clause had never felt like a condition. It felt like a promise. Each morning she walked the garden paths barefoot, dew chilling her soles, coffee in hand, voice sometimes murmuring to the wind. The rosemary grew thick, the hydrangeas rebloomed with grace, and a patch of zinnias now bore colors Margaret had once described as so bold they must be forgiven. Emily started volunteering at the community garden beside the library, and soon after, the ribbon-cutting buzz faded into something more durable. Habit. Presence. Kids came with dirt under their nails and stories in their pockets. Emily taught them how to hold a trowel, how to listen for bees before reaching into blossoms. She let them name the compost worm bin, Sir Wiggles V, and hung a chalkboard with a new quote every week, many of them Margaret's. Every Friday, Emily added a photo to the walls inside the house, not portraits of people, photos of seedlings breaking soil, a girl cradling a watering can, 2 boys arguing over how many sunflower seeds were too many. It became a living record of growth, not family tree, but family soil. Margaret's face now hung in the hallway just outside the kitchen. Not the cutout version, not the frozen Easter dress moment, but a candid one. She stood in the garden with one gloved hand raised, mid-laugh, dirt smudged across her cheek. Below it, engraved in stone, "Be present, even when they don't see you." M.H.W. Visitors always paused in front of it. Most smiled. Some cried. One spring afternoon, after the last daffodil had bowed and the first tomato sprouts peeked from their bed, Emily sat at Margaret's desk with a fresh legal pad. Notebooks filled with grocery lists and seed orders sat beside her, but this page was different. She opened the drawer, pulled out a smooth black pen, and wrote across the top in bold block letters, "Last Will and Testament, Emily Ruth Gardner." She sat for a long while, the tip of the pen resting just above the page, unpressed. Then, slowly, deliberately, she wrote the first name, Margaret H. Weston. She stared at the ink for a moment, then, beneath it, in smaller script, "In honor, always." The pen hovered again. A knock came at the door, one of the kids from the library garden probably. They always came early on Fridays. Emily set the pen down but left the will open. She smiled as she rose to answer it. And somewhere in the room, just maybe, just briefly, the scent of rosemary deepened, and the sunlight touched the portrait on the wall like a hand resting on a shoulder.